One area of hydrology that has generally not received much attention from hydrologists is wetlands. In fact, wetland hydrology is almost a subdiscipline unto itself, and there's a lot of ecologists who've gone into the void to address issues related to all sorts of physical processes, whether they're water dominated or even chemistry or geomorphic processes. And so I think it's important to consider the hydrology of tidal freshwater, well, of wetlands in general. And so as part of my PhD, I was working at the interdisciplinary interface between ecology, hydrology, and geomorphology, and tidal freshwater wetlands were a really great place to go to think about these dynamics. And that's because the tidal freshwater area is a boundary zone where rivers meet estuaries. Estuaries are boundary zones where rivers meet the sea, and we have the boundary zone, and the boundary zone is the tidal freshwater zone. So the tidal freshwater zone is where salinity is less than half a part per thousand, and as a result, there's very high sediment input from the watersheds that are draining to these locations. It's also interesting because for every one study of tidal freshwater systems, there's been 25 studies of salt marshes. So they're far less understood, even though they're much more important from a societal perspective, because tidal freshwater boundary is exactly where most urban areas have been built around the world. So here's some maps of Chesapeake Bay, and the blue shows the area from 0 to 5 parts per thousand. So the tidal freshwater zone would be a small fraction of what is shown in blue at the most upstream extent of the tributaries draining into the bay. Excuse me. Here are some aerial photos looking down on some individual tidal freshwater deltas that are growing out from the rivers. For example, in the Bohemia River in Chesapeake Bay, you can see the river in the right meandering through the sediment pile that it's depositing, that's growing into this sub-estuary. On the lower left, Port Tobacco. This is the infamous historical location for tobacco that was moved into colonial Maryland. The port's now several miles inland from its historical location because of the deposition of sediment that's taken place as a result of intensive land use in that lower watershed. Excuse me. And then here's the Sassafras River. Again, you can see the river that's coming in and the sediment that gets deposited. So if you go back and you look at the video podcasts that I've done that look at tidal systems, in general, this is a case where you have river dominance, as would be expected in terms of sediment deposition, maybe a quiescent sort of interior central lagoonal region, and then way out at the estuary front, you've got wind-driven longshore transport and wave processes. So that would be a basic conceptualization as a place to begin. On top of whatever the natural dynamics are, there's been wholesale deterioration of these systems as a result of human activities consisting of urbanization, deforestation, and intensive agriculture. And these have led to hydrological effects, chemical effects, and sediment effects. And sometimes these all get blended together, giving a cascade of processes leading to toxicity in the system, anoxia, turbidity and light limitation, and habitat conversion, seeing open water areas filled in and snuffed out, replaced ultimately by lowland terrestrial settings. In the tidal freshwater zone, we've seen the case where what was once present as what are thought of essentially, natural gardens of submerged aquatic vegetation that were highly productive, producing benthic organisms, things that lived on the bottom because the water was so crystal clear that light could penetrate through, and you had this dynamic community that could support the rearing of many fish species and diverse organisms, was just overwhelmed with sediment, leading to what you see today, which are lowland forests that get flooded out with just continuing massive amounts of sediment, taking an open water system and turning it into a forest. How do we know that's happened? Because we can go into these forests, dig down, and find the underlying estuarian muds and the sequences of macrofossils that are preserved in the sediment. So when I approached this problem for my PhD, I asked three broad questions. First, What are the spatiotemporal dynamics of sediment accumulation on a tidal freshwater delta? This is basically the response of the system in terms of geomorphic change that's taking place. Second, which ecological and hydrometeorological processes drive that sediment accumulation, and on what time scales and by what mechanisms do these controlling processes function? So once I know what's happening to the system, how can I explain it in terms of specific mechanisms? And then finally, beyond what one can observe over a few years, can we use sediment coring and paleoenvironmental reconstruction and then computer modeling to understand how watersheds and tidal freshwater deltas interact over a range of timescales spanning biweekly to interdecadal domains? And in this video podcast, I'm not going to go as much into this third one as the first two, but that was an important part of the work as well. The estuary that I looked at was a tributary of Chesapeake Bay called the Bush River. So we call this a sub-estuary just in the sense that it's a piece of the overall estuary. And the Bush River watershed is divided into two sub-watersheds, Winter's Run, which is shown in dark gray, and then the rest of the Bush River watershed, which also includes a small isolated watershed called the Ha Branch watershed. The basin area of 110 square kilometers, so it's relatively small. Historically, it was about 80% deforested as a result of logging activities that took place. But now some of that has returned, and we have about half forest, 23% grassland, 21% developed, and some farmland. There are also two water supply reservoirs. There's little gashes or lines across the river. Those are two water supply dams, and they're both almost completely full of sediment. Also, to the west of the system is the U.S. Aberdeen Proving Ground with its bomb testing and other kind of testing facilities there. We can begin with a little bit of historical analysis of the system. The first map that is available is from 1836. It shows the upper end of the system, which is called Otter Point Creek, and you can see, which I've highlighted in green, a distributary system. So you have a river coming out, it breaks into two, and that provides the indication that this is a delta. However, there's no wetland symbolization used or anything like that, but it does transition from the distributary channels to the open water. Then we can go to 1922. If I rescale by lining up the maps, the area in green from the 1836 map onto this, you can see it's a small piece. And now we can see more distributary channels going farther out into Otter Point Creek. We have a delta front that's prograded to this location. And then if we go to 1951, we can rescale again and see how much it's grown again. And even if we go back, if you look at this star where Ha Branch comes in, you can see how the delta moves, and by 1951 has now passed the location and incorporated the Ha Branch area. So over 120 years, the delta grew by a factor of 7.5. So that's pretty dramatic. And so we go out, collect sediment cores, work done by one of my associates and predecessors, Bill Hillgardner, and this is a photo of me back when I had hair and I was a young student, helping Bill collecting sediment cores. We can then see the different sedimentary strata present in the cores. We could get a basal carbon-14 date. We could use other methods from Paleoenvironmental Reconstruction to reconstruct different historically known events that took place in the watershed, and then put that together with a process of using pollen to adjust the sedimentation rate in each small interval of the core based on the relative abundance of pollen compared to the overall horizon sedimentation rate. These methods are beyond the purpose of this particular class, but they're really interesting methods. And so from that, we were able to come up with, and I should really say Bill Hillgardner was able to come up with 20-year average sedimentation rates from 1690 up to the present. In addition to that, I've coded on the top what habitats are indicated by the macrofossil seeds present in the sediment. So in the early period, there are relatively low sedimentation rates on the order of 1 millimeter per year, which is roughly on par with sea level rise for that region, a couple of millimeters per year. And at that time, we had submerged aquatic vegetation. Intensive agriculture began in the mid-1700s and reached a peak around the time of the Civil War when the plow began to be intensively used. So we had an early period of logging, and we saw a transition to middle marsh habitat, and then even by 1850 seeing shrub marsh at the particular site where this core was taken, and then that transitioning to just a forested condition. Note that once the 2 dams are built in the watershed, we saw a dramatic decline in sedimentation rates back to essentially pre-European levels. So this provides a very strong historical basis to try to say, well, what are the processes that are occurring in the system today, and how can we understand this history of change that's taken place? To approach the problem of modern hydrogeomorphic dynamics in a tidal freshwater wetland, really on a delta, the approach that I took was to use a control volume, right? So define the wetland as a control volume and ask the question, what are the forces driving the system? What is the nature of the system itself? And what are the responses that are happening dynamically? So the drivers here are called the external controls, and they are broadly composed of winds, watershed runoff, and astronomical tides. Now, things can drive winds that could range from diurnal fluctuations, regular storms for the temperate climate, could be snowmelt dynamics for watershed runoff, or it could be hurricanes. I mean, there's lots of different ultimate drivers, but whatever the ultimate drivers are, what they're doing is they're causing changes to wind, flow, and tides. And then on the right, it shows the data available to get that. So wind data came from meteorological stations at the Aberdeen Proving Ground. The runoff came from a really good USGS gauging station. Astronomical tides were measured with pressure transducers. The boundary condition relates to the fact that we're talking about the Earth's surface as the boundary. And so on that boundary, you have topography and vegetation. So doing elevation with real-time kinematic GPS, thanks to volunteer help from the Aberdeen Proving Ground. Plant associations were done, together, Bill Hillgardner and myself. In some areas, in other areas, was work that had already been done by Bill and his other students, all under the supervision of our PhD advisor, Grace Brush, I should say. And so we had those plant associations. So then what I really wanted to do was measure the response of the system in terms of water levels in different parts of the wetland, sedimentation and erosion processes, organic matter, grain size distributions, bulk density, water content, and even what's happening in terms of toxicity with inorganic metals. And I'm not going to go too much into the methods here, but we'll talk in particular about the sediment methods in a moment. So the study site is Otter Point Creek Delta in Maryland, and it's located within Bush River. And this is the resulting vegetation map that Bill Hillgardner produced and that I digitized. And so you can see there's a very large riparian forest with distributary channels anastomosing through that. There's an emergent marsh region with a variety of different elevation-related habitat types, going from shrub marsh to high marsh to middle marsh, low marsh, floating leaf habitat, and then the pioneer mudflat out in the front at the lowest elevation, and then the perennially inundated, subestuary. We determined the vegetation composition of that. The field work was done by Bill Hillgardner, and then I put that into a cluster analysis to come up with what the actual associations were. So there's a lot of vegetation work associated with this. But these photos just give you an idea of what they look like, and you can see how, from a physical perspective, the different leaf canopy structures and also the life histories of these different plants would play an important role in the trapping of sediment or controlling the flow of water through them. One of the key central aspects of the work that I did was measuring sedimentation rates. That was done using a technology that I developed called the net sedimentation tile. Tidal freshwater wetlands, as you'll see in a moment, have potentially very high sedimentation rates, but also highly variable sedimentation rates over a 2-week period. And as a result of that, we wanted to have the ability to get a lot of sediment. Prior to this method, the main method that was being used was to put filter paper out on a wetland, but filter paper would just be overwhelmed by the amount of sediment, and filter paper wouldn't also give you wouldn't be able to look at erosion. Another approach was marker horizons, and then around, also at the same time that I was developing the net sedimentation tile method, there was the sedimentation and erosion table approach, but that involves a relatively expensive system, and it primarily focuses on just measuring elevation. It leaves a lot of processes unaccounted for, and it doesn't give you samples. It requires also using marker beds associated with it. So there's a lot of advantages to net sedimentation tile as a method, especially when you have highly variable and large sediment fluxes that you want to have samples for processing and analysis. On the right shows a photo using in a very different context. It's on a lowland floodplain in California, and the blue line highlights where the tile is, and you can see the amount of deposition that the tile was able to handle. So then in terms of the experimental design, the approach that was used here was complicated by 2 factors. First, this is a wetland and it's very sensitive. There's no boardwalks present in the system, so have to think of an approach where if you're going to monitor once every 2 weeks, how can you do this without hurting the wetland? And then second, it's a relatively large system, and so if I want to get samples all in a day, I need an efficient way to do that. The main aspect of the sampling approach was to stratify on the basis of habitat type, to try to get a representation. However, I wasn't in a position where I could go out and randomly select locations from anywhere and just walk around and destroy the whole watershed. Nor could I use a uniform grid for the same reason. So I had to have a transect-based approach. Now, when you look at this map, it may be hard to see some of the transects. There's one main transect 7 that's really easy to see. The first number is the transect number, and then P is like plate, and then the number of that plate or tile is shown. So there's, I believe, I don't know, at least 31 different locations. And this is just for the overall Otter Point Creek. And then there was a separate sampling that was done in the Haha Branch wetland. So there's an uneven amount of effort. It's not equal effort because of the challenge of getting to different sites. And also, of course, today, 20 years after I designed this, literally 20 years later, I've got a much better grasp on how I would go about it, but there's still fundamental constraints that are hard to get around. If I just take all the data and just throw it on a page, let's see what we get. So the x-axis is sampling date, July 1st, 1995 to April 1st, 1997. This is data from the Haha Branch wetland, so it's the smaller system. I did parallel studies between the two. I've published all of that, but just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to present this result for this presentation. So if you look at this data, the y-axis shows sedimentation rate, which ranges from erosive to depositional. The data is in grams per square centimeter. I could do this as grams per square centimeter per 2 weeks, which would be relatively small numbers, but then you wouldn't be able to compare it against other studies. So I normalized the data to a year to have a similar basis of comparison as other journal articles report, even though I'm only measuring the data for 2 weeks. What you can see is that during the summer in both years, we have high values and highly variable values. And in the winter, we have low values. Note that the repetition through here is artificial. It's basically one sample because during the winter it's frozen and it's not possible to go out and I didn't want to like break through the ice and disturb the whole system. So once I saw that it was encased in ice, that was the end of the sampling. And then as soon as the ice broke up and I could get in again, I got the sample, and that's the average sample over the whole winter. So it's one preserved value over that winter period. And so obviously they're low, but the spatial variability between them is dramatically lower. And in the second winter, we actually see some sites with substantial erosion. So how can we explain this variability? Well, one hypothesis might be that the envelope of this curve would relate to floods. What if we have seasonal variation in flow? And so could we plot the envelope of this curve and find that relationship with discharge? Sedimentation rate varied over orders of magnitude, so I plot the envelope of that curve here, and then here's the discharge of water coming out of winter's run coming into the system. What you can see that is, in fact, there is no relationship between these two. At times when sedimentation rates are going down, we have flows going up. Here's a going up. Of course, there's variations in the winter that can't really be captured, but maybe there's even, here it's going down, this is going up, it's continuing down, then this is going down. And I mean, it's just isn't, it isn't working. There isn't a systematic relationship here at all. So the next thing I did was I took this data and I said, well, what if I stratify it by habitat type? After all, I had sampled it to represent each habitat, so now let's see what we get. And when we do that, we can see significant differences between the different vegetation associations. The Pioneer Mudflat has the highest rates by far, and varying over a wide range, and widely varying values over the summertime. Then the floating leaf marsh, then the low marsh, middle marsh, high marsh. So in general, as you go from a more open water condition further up towards the forest, you get a decreasing sedimentation rate. And the area that experienced the most amount of erosion was in the low marsh. We could do the same for organic content and find the inverse effect. So in this case, the high marsh has the highest organic content, and the Pioneer Mudflat has the lowest organic content. The floating leaf and low marsh are relatively simple. Similar. Middle marsh is the same. Now, with both of these data sets, we were able to run Mann-Whitney U-tests and show that in almost all cases, they are significantly differentiated. I can't remember exactly, but I would imagine that these two, the blue and the green lines here, are quite similar. But that was the statistical test used to show that these are in fact stratified. We could look at individual sites and see some individual mechanisms at work. For example, on levees in the high marsh, where there were floods that took place, we saw significant spikes in sedimentation recorded at individual sites. Here's a location on the middle marsh where a beaver came in and made a beaver lodge and opened up a lot of areas to clear out vegetation to make the lodge. Where those areas were cleared out, the beaver had actually pushed the elevation down, removed the vegetation. That allowed for more water and sediment to come in, and deposition rates therefore went up. You could also see that a year after the beaver activity, the site with activity suffered from erosion, whereas the site without activity did not. And so that shows the destabilization caused by beaver, both in terms of positive deposition and negative erosion. So what we saw is bi-weekly seasonal time series with large fluctuations, and then seasonal cycles governed by the seasonal cycles of vegetation growth and death, and differentiation on the basis of the different morphologies and life histories of the vegetation associations. The next question to ask is, if you time average, can we see a difference in the geomorphology of the system without vegetation and with vegetation to try to isolate what really is the role of vegetation in controlling sedimentation rate? So first, I took data when there was no vegetation present, which is the springtime. So in the wintertime, because this is a freshwater system, we have a lot of ice present. The ice removes any remaining, vegetation that's present there. It's like a lawnmower, right? It just cuts it all off. But in any case, most of these, we have a lot of annual species that just die off every year in the late fall anyway. So we go to the spring with a wide open, bare ground, and we have processes of erosion and deposition. So I've colored by habitat type here, and then I tried to explore a whole bunch of geomorphic variables to see what would control the observed log of the sedimentation rate, which is on the y-axis. And this is the thing where you throw the whole kitchen sink, your whole pantry in here and see what you get. And what you can see is that regardless of all the complicated assumptions that go into statistical testing anyway, the r-squared value here is relatively low. So there's relatively low explanatory power. And in fact, when you look at the data here, for any one value on the x, like the only variable that mattered was distance from the subtidal front. So like where you're at the very transition between the perennial water to mudflat. If you look at the distance of any one site from that, there's some small relationship. But when you actually look at it, you could be at any one value here and have any wide range of sedimentation rate. So it looks to me like there's no result here. And in fact, 4 sites are erosional, and so they're not even, I think they're even represented on here. Now what happens when the vegetation is present? So the vegetation comes in, we get the summer sedimentation rates. Now what do we get? It's a totally different story. We can see that the rate of deposition is highly in tune with the different plant community that's here. What I did is I developed something I call a habitat index, which is a measure of the habitat type based on the abundance of the different species that are present at the spot and what habitat each species is representative of. We published a journal article that showed that vegetation method, which is a separate topic. So habitat index and distance from the nearest distributary channel were the 2 variables, and they together explained 84% of the variability. And now, if you go up from here, you have a relatively short range of sedimentation rates that are spanned compared to the total range. So it is very high predictability, of which 77% is explained by vegetation. Notice that in neither of these cases does elevation play a role. Elevation does have a relationship to the habitat index, but as you can see, the fact that elevation didn't control when no vegetation was present is the indicator that it's not that elevation controls vegetation and therefore elevation is what's controlling sedimentation rate. No, it's that vegetation is its own independent variable, influenced by elevation, but other factors as well, and it is what's controlling sedimentation rate directly. If this relationship is not just a mere spurious correlation, but is in fact a process-based mechanism, then what happens if you disturb a site? The site should then respond in a way that's predictable by that mechanism. And in fact, that's what we see, because as I already mentioned, animals disturb the site. So here's the relationship between habitat index and sedimentation rate for 2 different settings, the Haha Branch wetland in 95, Otter Point Creek in the summer of 96. And what you can see is that when a site was disturbed, it started off as a high marsh, I believe, middle marsh, and then its sedimentation rate went up. And then the next year when we came out, it had changed to a low marsh. And so it was then expected to have a higher sedimentation rate, and that's what we saw. So there is a dynamic response here that's a negative feedback loop that higher disturbance led to higher sedimentation rates and a change in habitat type, which then eventually the sedimentation rate filled it back in, and then you would get back to this middle marsh condition. There also was a muskrat impacted site that was a high marsh that reverted to a middle marsh. And then in the Haha Branch wetland, we saw sites that had reverted to low marsh that had been animal impacted as well. We also did analysis of organic content. Here's the spring result. There is some R squared here, again, distance from tidal front. But again, for any specific distance value, you seem to have two different, ranges of values of organic content. So it really isn't helpful at all. But when you get to summer vegetated condition, now it all lines up. We have 83% explainability. But notice here, the x-axis is elevation dominated, elevation and distance to subtidal front. I think this vegetation, 77% of variation, is a carryover. It probably shouldn't be there. But anyway, so we have a very high predictability here of organic content. We also saw grain size controls, and the grain size controls were only present during the summer when vegetation was there, and we can see that distance from subtidal front and distance from distributary channel explain 62% of the variation in the ratio of sand to clay. We also saw what are called hydraulic sorting lines. So this is called a ternary diagram. It shows the combination of sand, silt, and clay. So in the channel, you have almost 100% sand, and then there's hydraulic sorting, which means as energy goes down, as you move from channel to the delta front, then the grain size goes from sand to a mix of silt and clay. And then as you go into the distant marsh regions, you go from that mix of silt and clay to largely clay. We also saw that there are fundamental limits on sedimentation rate in that no matter what, like in the lowest energy condition, even if there's no influx of tidal sediment, you have material that's generated from the plants in the wetland, and so you can get a minimum bioaccumulation rate as a result of that accumulation of autochthonous material. On the other hand, at the high end, even if you have a hurricane, there's only so much sediment that's going to come in. Now, of course, during the 2-year period I had, although we had 5 hurricanes, there was no direct hit. So maybe it's possible to go over this, but for the available energy we saw, it just wasn't crossing that threshold. We also saw chemical responses in the system. If we look at where things like copper, zinc, iron, or organic content was coming from or going, we saw that there were some differences relative to the tidal source that things were coming from. And so we can see that, for example, there was a strong additional input of organic matter and iron in the system, which could be related to the vegetation processes that are there, but other places like the high marsh were eroding, and these were sources that were then going to other places, and the other place was the low marsh. So we had material, redistribution of metal within the marsh, as well as additional inputs that are coming into this site beyond just the regular tidal flux, and that could be from urban stormwater surrounding the wetland, or just redistribution from like high marsh and floating leaf into the low marsh where it was being sequestered. So overall, if we average within a particular season, we could see the role of vegetation in creating order in the system. When no vegetation is present, the geomorphic dynamics were highly variable. When vegetation was present, it became highly ordered, where the vegetation was either controlling what was happening or it enabled elevation and distance metrics to play a role. The next step was to get into the details of how winds and tides control the system. Now this is where a whole nother realm of hydrology comes into play, which is called time series analysis. Time series analysis, you might think, might have to do with looking at how things vary through time, but it really has more to do with when you have a signal, trying to understand what are the frequencies of that signal and how different frequencies combine to create different processes. So a frequency would mean like if you have tides going up and down, so you have a high tide once every 12 hours, then that's a tidal period, or 1/12 would be the tidal frequency in hours. And there are a lot of different analyses that can be done, and I'm not going to go into the details of how those will work, but I'm just going to show you some of the results to give you an idea for the kinds of things we can see. So the first thing we can do is we can reveal what's called the power spectrum of a signal. And we can do that not just for one moment in time, but how that varies over a period of a couple of years. So along the axis that's going along frequency here is the distribution of winds that are moving up the Bush River towards this wetland, the north-south winds. And what you can see is where there is this topography here in this graph, that's showing that there is energy associated with that aspect of the data on those frequencies. So frequency 1 means once per day, and you can see that in fact winds do exhibit a heating and cooling diurnal cycle. But then there are also changes in wind patterns that occur once a week or twice a week that are revealed here. And then if you go from January 1st, 1995 to January 1st, 1996 and beyond, you can see that the two discernible peaks that were present in the winter coalesce and decrease in their strength during the summertime and then reemerge each winter. So during winter, we have very strong wind dynamics that are taking place, and they're strongly organized with periodicities at the 3 to 7 day interval. If you look at discharge, of course, discharge doesn't show any of that structure. All you see in discharge data is just the annual cycle of snowmelt runoff. And that cycle is modulated through time so that there are times when the annual cycle is very strong, control and runoff, and other times when random floods or weather-driven events are more important than that annual cycle. This is the water level fluctuations through time. You can see the semi-diurnal tide, diurnal tide, but you can also see the structure of wind-induced variations in water level shown here at frequencies of less than once every 2 days to once every 7 days. Now the next thing that we can do is we can look at correlations between water levels and runoff or winds. Correlation doesn't mean take your data, put it in a column, take the other data, put it in a column, and calculate the correlation in Excel. What it means is take this frequency distribution and this frequency distribution and see if the frequencies themselves are correlated, which is an analysis called coherence analysis. And what you can see are 1 year worth of data. The south, this is the correlation essentially between winds and water levels in the system. The blue graphs show the south to north wind component, and the yellow graphs show the east to west wind, because Bush River is aligned so that both of these could be relevant. The top graph shows correlation, like R squared, for each individual frequency, and it goes from, I've cut it off so that you only see high R squared values that are statistically significant above the 95% confidence level, which in this case has to be greater than 0.4, and then getting up towards 1. We can see that overall there's more coherence between south-north winds and water levels compared to east-west winds and water levels. Although in some cases we see the same peaks indicated, which means that what we really have is a wind coming, say, from the southwest or the northeast, and so it has both of those present. But there's generally more wind driving change to water levels in the south to north direction. The bottom axis is hard to understand, but what it looks at is the timing. Which comes first? Does the wind come and then does water level change, and how long does that take? And it shows in some cases no lag, in other cases a few hours or even days, which sort of raises some questions about the significance of that. But in this case, with the south to north wind, we see a pretty strong response that is coherent with the driving force of the winds. We can also look at the relationship between water levels and discharge, and we see more lags here and less overall coherence. So if we look, for example, at a discharge of the Susquehanna River in Winter's Run and then the water levels, you generally don't see a lot of relationships here. Like the biggest event shown here for Otter Point Creek is not associated with a runoff event, but is instead the result of a wind-driven event associated with a hurricane. So here's an example from a hurricane, Edouard and Fran. You have runoff being relatively small, but the west-east wind speed shows a very large excursion, and the south to north wind speed shows a very large excursion. And in response to those excursions in wind speed, a very large change in water levels. So what we've done here, just to take a step back, we've left the realm of sediment and we've come to the realm of hydrometeorology. We're trying to understand why sediment is depositing, and to do that we first have to understand the meteorology and the hydrology of the driving mechanisms, which means water levels, winds, and runoff. And what we've revealed here is that water levels are largely controlled over these hourly to weekly time periods by fluctuations in wind, particularly the south to north wind speed. Okay, so how can we get how this connects to sediment deposition and erosion? What we can do is we can come up with a computer model it's an analytical model, but it basically says if you take these winds and the changes in water levels and then we drive sediment entrainment off the bed of this system, how would we do that? Well, winds drive waves, and the size of the waves is influenced by water levels. Water levels and waves create velocities, and then there's bed roughness, and we want to know how resistant is the bed material to being eroded. Depending on how far the wind is blowing over, we can get different sized waves. So we get wave conditions, we get velocities, and then we figure out what kind of erosion processes can be taking place. This is something that the Virginia Institute of Marine Science does to figure out how erodible bed material is. They essentially put an annular flume on the bottom of the estuary, spin it up, and see how material erodes. And that gives us these critical shear stress values in units of Pascal that range from 0.05 to 1 Pascal, but largely at this 0.1 level for cohesive muds. And so we can come up with these analytical solutions that tell us for a really high water depth and low wind speed, there's going to be really low shear stresses. For very shallow water, a high wind blowing over that is going to have easy access to scour material, and so we get very high shear stresses. So this puts together in a single analytical solution how water depth and wind speed affect erosion in the river, in the wetland. And then we can take that and apply that through time and calculate the bed shear stress, and also consider the influence of tides to see when is the direction of sediment entrainment moving into the wetland to deposit the material, or out of the wetland to basically export. And you can see in the net there's more yellow in the into direction than out of. You could also see, if you cut this off at 0.1, there's plenty of time when the bed shear stress is enough to get work done here. And in fact, if you could take individual bed shear stresses, like 0.1 Pascal is exceeded once every 3 hours. So this is the cumulative distribution function this is the non-exceedance probability, and we can see that 1 Pascal is exceeded every 4 days, and 1/10 of a Pascal every 3 hours. If we also classify the bed shear stress into different domains on the basis of the kind of work that could be done, you can see the distribution of the percent of time, and then what fetch is driving it, and whether it's import or export from the system. Another way of looking at this is just taking the data for each week and seeing, well, what's the sedimentation rate we saw over a 2-week interval, and what was the duration of flooding in that period. And there's also a strong correlation here. So more flooding leads to more sediment deposition. We also saw an individual process where we had a normal deposition low deposition, and then normal deposition again over 3 periods. It's not the amount of deposition isn't shown on this graph, but there, these vertical lines indicate 3 periods, and period 14 was a period of low deposition. It turns out that during period 14 there was a storm event where there was runoff, but more importantly, you can see that the wind, especially the west-east wind, was blowing very strong. We had wind speeds pushing out at about 3.5 meters per second, and that would lead to bed shear stresses of up to 0.4 pascals. So the wind blew the water level down, created shear stress, and as a result of that, the sedimentation rate for that 2-week period on a whole was lower than other ones. So overall, it's possible to do field work to come up with data needed to create a model that can help us predict when erosion and deposition is going to take place in the wetland. And so I'm not going to go into the long-term delta processes, but overall what happens is sediment is supplied to the delta as a result of human activities on the watershed. As I said, deforestation, intensive agriculture, and urbanization. That sediment deposits out on the delta front as a result of distributary channels that grow in through the mudflat and inject the sediment farther out into the subestuary. Then tides and winds pick up that material and hydraulically sort it inward towards the mudflat and through the emergent marsh system, creating differential deposition on the basis of the vegetation associations that are present there. So that's the overall story of what's happening, and you can see what was involved in this process was taking a control volume approach, considering the external controls, the boundary conditions, and the response variables, using a blend of field work, spatial analysis, and computer simulations to try to put together all of the different aspects of how the physical processes are functioning in the system. Okay, I think that's